The winter of 1876 grabbed Silver Creek and squeezed. The wind had teeth and the air was thin and sharp, so cold it felt like breathing in splinters of glass. Down in the town's biggest barn, the one they used for dances when the mood struck, the air was thick with the smell of cedar, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Lanterns threw a warm yellow glow on faces flushed from the cold and the fiddles, their light sliding over the scuffed-up floorboards, where boots were stomping out a rhythm against the frost clinging to the world outside. Eliza Mayfield stood by the cider barrel trying to look smaller than she was. She was barely 18, with hair the color of a dying fire and eyes that saw too much. Her hands, rough and calloused from a life of mending and baking and pulling stubborn roots from frozen ground, kept smoothing the front of her faded blue dress. She wasn't here to dance. She was here for a dose of warmth, a little noise to chase away the silence of her small cabin on the edge of town. She was here for a reminder that other people still existed. And then there was him, Sheriff Arlland Crowe. He stood in the center of the room like a spider in the middle of a web, his black coat absorbing the lantern light. The silver badge pinned to his chest wasn't a symbol of the law. It was a warning. It glinted like a shard of ice. His voice was a low rumble that cut through the music, and his grin was the kind that made you check if you still had your wallet. Silver Creek was his town. The merchants paid his fees. The saloon owner poured his whiskey with a trembling hand. The people just got out of his way. His eyes found Eliza. They always found Eliza. He'd been watching her for weeks. A quiet word at the general store that felt like a brand. A slow ride past her cabin that felt like a threat. She'd heard the whispers. That girl's his next claim. But standing there under the swinging lanterns with the fiddles scraping away, she felt a spark of something hard and sharp in her chest. She was no man's prize. The music swirled, a dizzying, frantic tune. But the air went still when Crowe started walking. His boots didn't stomp with the music. They fell like hammers, deliberate and heavy. Each step was a claim of ownership on the wooden floor, on the air, on the people who watched him pass. He stopped right in front of her, so close she could smell the sour tobacco on his breath. "Dance with me," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a command. His hand went to her waist, his fingers cold even through the thin fabric of her dress. The world seemed to hold its breath. The fiddles stuttered, the laughter died. Every eye in that barn was on them. Eliza's heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs, but her face was a mask of stone. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Crowe's grin tightened into a snarl. His fingers dug into her waist, bruising. "You'll regret that, girl." The air was so thick you could have choked on it. Every person in that barn was frozen, waiting for the thunder to break. And then Eliza's hand moved. It wasn't a thought. It was an instinct, a rebellion that had been simmering for weeks. Her palm met his cheek with a crack that was louder than any fiddle, sharper than any gunshot. His head snapped to the side. A dark red welt began to bloom on his skin. He staggered back a step, his hand flying to his face, his silver badge wobbling in the lantern light. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass. The fiddler's bow hung limp in his hand. Crowe's eyes, when he turned them back on her, were not filled with pain. They were filled with a cold, murderous fire that promised a reckoning, a fury that would burn down everything she was. "You'll pay for that," he growled, the words slithering out, low and venomous. His hand dropped from his cheek and twitched, just for a second, toward the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. But he didn't draw. Not yet. The punishment he had in mind was slower, more public. Eliza stood her ground, her own hand stinging, her breath coming in white puffs in the suddenly cold air. Her heart was a war drum, but her spine was a rod of iron. She was the girl who baked bread for the widow Harper when her pantry was bare, the girl who'd mended the blacksmith's shirt for a nickel, but she was also the girl who'd faced down blizzards and dragged water from a frozen well. She was no wilting flower. The silence in the barn was an accusation, and it wasn't aimed at the sheriff. It was aimed at her, the girl who had dared, the girl who had broken the unspoken rule of Silver Creek. You do not cross Arlland Crowe. A few women started whispering behind their hands, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, thrilling excitement. One of the deputies, a boy no older than her with a face full of freckles, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand resting nervously on his rifle. He wouldn't meet her eyes. No one would. Crowe's voice sliced through the tension, cold and final. "She's a traitor," he declared, his voice ringing with false authority. He pointed a thick finger at her. "She's been consorting with the Comanche." The lie was so sudden, so absurd, it took a moment to land. But land it did, like a lit match in a hayloft. Murmurs erupted. Fear was a powerful thing, and the fear of Comanche raiders was a story whispered to children in their beds. It didn't need proof. It only needed a spark. Crowe's badge was all the proof they needed. He didn't stop there. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single dark arrow. The fletching was made from a hawk's feather, the arrowhead chipped from black flint. "Found this in her woodpile this morning," he snarled, holding it up for all to see. "She's guiding them, putting us all in danger." It was a lie, a bald, shameless lie. The arrow was too clean, too perfect, but in the dim, flickering light of the barn, doubt was a luxury no one could afford. They saw the badge, they saw the arrow, and they saw a girl who had just struck a man of the law. The conclusion was simple. It was terrifying. It was wrong. But it was simple. Eliza opened her mouth to protest, to scream, but Crowe's hand shot out and clamped around her arm like a vice. His fingers dug into her flesh, bruising the bone. "You'll learn your place," he hissed, his face inches from hers. He gave a sharp nod to his men. 2 deputies moved in, their faces grim, their eyes hard. They didn't look at her. They looked through her. They grabbed her arms and twisted them behind her back, binding her wrists with a length of coarse rope that bit into her skin like fire. She struggled, her dress tearing at the shoulder, but it was useless. The barn doors were thrown open, and a blast of Arctic wind swept in, carrying a flurry of snow that danced across the floorboards. The warmth was gone. The fiddles were silent. She was dragged out into the frozen night. The amber glow of the barn shrank behind her, the faces in the doorway pale and indistinct. Crowe followed, his long coat flapping around him like the wings of a vulture. He was smiling now. Eliza's eyes scanned the crowd one last time. Mrs. Harper, clutching her shawl, her face a mask of pity and fear. Tom the blacksmith, his big hands hanging uselessly at his sides. None of them moved. None of them spoke. Their courage was a currency Crowe had taken from them long ago. The rope tightened, and she felt warm blood begin to trickle over her numb fingers. But her gaze was fierce, her chin was high, and she burned their silent betrayal into her memory. They led her through the empty streets of Silver Creek, their boots the only sound, crunching on the ice. They weren't taking her to the jail. They were walking toward the cliffs at the edge of town, where the wind howled a lonely, hungry song. The snow was coming down harder now, swallowing their tracks, erasing them, as if the whole world had agreed to forget this night had ever happened. The wind was a living thing, a shrieking beast that tore at her clothes as they forced her to the edge of the cliff. The drop was a black maw, an endless throat that promised to swallow her whole. For a moment, she saw the lights of Silver Creek below, small and distant, like fallen stars, the town she had called home, the people who were letting this happen. Crowe stood behind her, his breath hot on her neck. "This is what happens to traitors," he whispered, and then his boot shoved hard against the small of her back. The world vanished. There was no up, no down, only the screaming wind and the dizzying, sickening sensation of falling. The rope on her wrists caught on something, a jagged outcrop of rock, and for a half-second she dangled there, her shoulder threatening to tear from its socket. Then the rope snapped, and she was falling again, tumbling through the darkness. Her faded blue dress snagged and ripped on rocks she couldn't see. The fall seemed to last an eternity. She didn't scream. The air was stolen from her lungs. She closed her eyes and waited for the end. The impact wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a final, shattering crack. It was a brutal, jarring thud that seemed to drive the very air from her body. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in her ribs, in her leg, in her head. Then, mercifully, there was only blackness. When she woke, it was to the cold. A deep, penetrating cold that had sunk into her bones. She was lying on something narrow, a ledge. Snow, thick and soft, had cushioned her fall, a cruel miracle that had saved her from death only to deliver her to a slower, colder end. Her breath was a shallow, ragged thing, each gasp sending a fresh wave of agony through her chest. Her left leg was twisted at an angle that made her stomach churn, and she could feel wetness matting her hair, blood. Above, the cliff edge was a hard black line against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The first hints of dawn were breaking. She was alive. But for how long? Sheriff Crowe's men were gone. Their tracks were already being filled by the relentless snow. The land itself seemed determined to keep their secret. Eliza lay still, the world swimming in and out of focus. She tried to move, to push herself up, but the pain was a physical wall pinning her down. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, clawed at the snow. The broken ends of the rope were still tied tight around her wrists, a testament to the town's verdict. A memory of the barn flickered in her mind. The warmth, the music, Mrs. Harper's averted gaze. Then the memory sharpened, focusing on Crowe's sneer. The image burned away the fog of pain, stoking a tiny, defiant ember of rage in her chest. She would not die here. She would not let him win. A sound broke the frozen silence. Not the wind. Something else. The crunch of a boot on snow, hesitant and light. Her heart hammered against her broken ribs. Had they come back to finish the job? She held her breath, trying to make herself a part of the rock. A small figure appeared at the edge of the cliff above. A boy. Hunched against the wind, his face pale beneath a hat that was far too big for him. It was Jesse, the 10-year-old son of Caleb, one of Crowe's most loyal gunslingers. His eyes, wide with a fear that was older than his years, scanned the abyss below. He had slipped away from the posse as they rode back to town, a sickening guilt churning in his stomach. He remembered Eliza giving him a piece of warm bread just last week, her smile genuine and kind. He couldn't shake the image. He had stolen a coil of rope from his father's saddlebag, his small hands fumbling with the unfamiliar knots. He tied one end to a gnarled, wind-swept pine, the bark scraping his palms raw. He lowered the other end over the edge, his voice a trembling whisper against the wind. "Miss Eliza? Are you down there?" The boy's voice was a lifeline. It pulled her back from the brink. Eliza stirred, lifting her head. The world tilted violently, but she saw it. A rope, dangling just out of reach. Pain screamed through her leg as she dragged herself across the snow-dusted rock, her fingers scraping against the stone. She reached, her bound hands clumsy, her muscles screaming in protest. Just a little further. As her fingers brushed against the coarse fibers of the rope, another shadow moved below her. She froze. On a lower, even narrower outcrop of rock, a man was stirring. He wasn't one of Crowe's men. He was tall and lean, his dark hair long and unbound. His clothes were buckskin, and his arm was stained with blood. A deep gash ran along his thigh. He looked up, his eyes dark and sharp, first at the boy, then at her. It was Nikai, a Comanche warrior she had only seen in town from a distance, a silent figure who drew fearful stares. He had been ambushed by Crowe's men 2 days prior, left for dead on this very cliff. Jesse's rope, meant for Eliza, reached him first. He grabbed it, his movements slow and pained, but efficient. He climbed, hauling his injured body upward, his face a mask of determined agony. He reached Eliza's ledge and collapsed for a moment, his breath ragged. He saw her, pale as the snow, her eyes flickering. Then he saw the ropes that bound her. Without a word, Nikai drew a knife from a sheath on his belt. The blade was worn smooth with years of use. Eliza flinched, her body tensing. The stories, the whispers in town about savage killers flooded her mind, but his hands were steady. He sliced through the ropes on her wrists with one clean cut. The fibers fell away, leaving raw, bleeding furrows in her skin. Nikai's silence was a heavy blanket. His own scars told a story of loss at the hands of men like Crowe. But Jesse's voice, small and urgent, cut through the tension from above. "She's hurt, mister. You gotta help her." Nikai's gaze softened, but it wasn't for Eliza. It was for the boy who saw no enemy, only a person in need. He sheathed his knife. Then carefully, gently, he lifted Eliza into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird. He carried her away from the cliff's edge, toward a dark shadow in the rock face she hadn't seen before. The mouth of a hidden cave. The cave was a pocket of stillness, a welcome reprieve from the biting wind. The air inside was damp, smelling of wet stone and old pine needles. Nikai laid Eliza down gently on the cold ground. He gathered a small pile of dry twigs from a corner, striking a flint against his knife until a tiny spark caught. A small fire crackled to life, its weak glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. Eliza's breathing began to even out, though each inhale was a fresh battle with the pain in her ribs. The warmth from the fire was a ghost of a touch on her frozen skin, but it was enough to tether her to the living world. Jesse scrambled down the rope and scurried into the cave, his eyes wide, darting between the injured woman and the silent warrior. "They'll come looking for me," he whispered, his voice shaking. "For all of us." Nikai just nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his gaze fixed on the cave's entrance. Eliza's mind reeled. A tyrant sheriff, a boy's courage, a stranger's mercy. She was trapped on a cliffside with a wanted Comanche and the son of her enemy. Outside, the snow fell harder, a relentless white curtain, cloaking them in a fragile, temporary peace. Nikai tore a strip of cloth from the bottom of his own tunic and began to carefully wrap Eliza's bleeding leg, his touch firm but surprisingly gentle. She watched him, her fear warring with the undeniable truth of his actions. This man, this savage from the town's fearful tales, was saving her life. The wind howled outside, carrying the distant, faint smell of wood smoke from Silver Creek. A reminder that judgment was not a cliff's edge, but a town full of silent witnesses, and they would not be silent forever. The fire was a fragile heartbeat in the stone womb of the cave. For 3 days it was their sun and their moon. Eliza drifted in and out of a painful haze, the world shrinking to the flickering flames, the damp chill of the rock at her back, and the 2 figures who moved like ghosts in the shadows. Her leg throbbed with a life of its own, a relentless drum of agony. Nikai had set the bone as best he could, splinting it with pieces of a broken branch and strips torn from his own shirt. The act was so contrary to the stories she'd been fed her whole life that the cognitive dissonance was almost as painful as the injury. She watched him. He moved with a quiet economy, every action deliberate. He would grind herbs he'd pulled from a leather pouch into a bitter-smelling paste and apply it to her leg and his own wounded thigh. He never spoke unless necessary. His silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with things unsaid, a history she couldn't begin to guess at. Jesse was their bridge. He chattered to fill the silence, his boyish voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. He told them about his dog, about the time he'd almost caught a legendary catfish in the creek, about his mother. His mother, he explained, had died a year ago, and his father, Caleb, had changed. He'd grown quiet and hard, falling deeper under Sheriff Crowe's shadow. "He ain't bad," Jesse insisted, poking the fire with a stick. "Not all the way. He's just stuck." On the fourth day, a fever took hold of Eliza. The cave walls seemed to sweat and press in on her. The shadows danced and warped into monstrous shapes. She saw Sheriff Crowe's face in the flames, his grin wide and predatory. She cried out, thrashing, the pain in her leg flaring into a white-hot nova. A cool hand pressed against her forehead. She flinched, her eyes flying open. Nikai was kneeling beside her, holding a tin cup of water to her lips. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that startled her. "Drink," he said. It was the first word he had spoken directly to her. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. She drank, the cool water a blessing on her parched throat. As he pulled the cup away, his gaze fell on the beaded necklace she always wore. It had been her mother's. He reached out, his fingers gently touching the beads. He didn't try to take it. He just traced the pattern with his thumb. "My grandmother made this," he said, his voice quiet. Eliza stared at him, confused. "My mother. She said a trader sold it to her." Nikai shook his head slowly. "No, it was a gift, given to a white woman who saved a child from a flooded creek many winters ago. My cousin." He looked from the necklace to her face, a new light in his eyes. The child was saved, but the woman, her family was driven from their land a year later by a man with a silver badge. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The land. Her family's land. The cabin she now lived in alone. It wasn't random. Crowe's obsession with her, his desire to drive her out or own her, wasn't just about pride or lust. It was about the land itself. "Why?" she whispered. "What's on that land?" Before Nikai could answer, Jesse, who had been keeping watch at the mouth of the cave, let out a sharp gasp. "Someone's coming," he hissed. "Just one rider." Nikai was on his feet in an instant, moving to the entrance, his knife in his hand. He peered out through a crack in the rock. The rider was slow, his horse picking its way carefully through the snow. He wore a deputy's star. It was the young one from the barn, the one with the freckles and the haunted eyes. He stopped his horse 100 yards from the cliff, dismounted, and seemed to be studying the ground. He was tracking them. "He's alone," Nikai murmured. "Crowe must have sent him to scout." "Maybe he wants to help," Jesse whispered, his voice full of a desperate hope. The deputy, whose name was Miller, began to walk toward the cliff face, his hand resting on his gun. He looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed. He was close now, so close they could see the way his breath plumed in the air. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Eliza? Miss Mayfield? If you're in there, I just want to talk." Eliza's heart pounded. Was this a trick? Nikai remained silent, a predator waiting. Jesse looked at Eliza, his eyes pleading. "He was kind to my ma," Jesse said. "He brought her medicine once." Against her better judgment, a sliver of hope took root in Eliza's heart. She dragged herself toward the cave mouth. "I'm here, deputy," she called out, her voice hoarse. "What do you want?" Miller let out a sigh of relief. "Thank God. I saw what he did. It was wrong. I want to help you. I brought food. Medicine." He held up a saddlebag. He took a few steps closer. "Just let me—" A single deafening crack echoed across the valley. It wasn't from Miller's gun. The deputy jerked, a look of profound surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He staggered backward, his eyes wide, and then he fell face first into the snow. The saddlebag dropped beside him, its contents spilling onto the white ground. High on the ridge opposite the cliff, a figure stood, a smoking rifle in his hand. Even from this distance they could see the glint of his silver badge, Sheriff Crowe. He hadn't sent the deputy to scout. He had used him as bait. He had been watching them the whole time. Rage, pure and undiluted, washed through Eliza, clearing the last of the fever fog from her mind. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about justice. Nikai pulled her back from the entrance as another shot rang out, chipping stone from the cave mouth. "He knows we're here," Nikai said, his voice grim. "He won't risk coming down in the light, but he'll come tonight." Jesse was crying, silent tears tracking paths through the dirt on his cheeks. He had believed in the good of a man, and he had watched that man die for it. The boy's hope had been extinguished, and in its place, something harder was taking root. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked from the dead deputy in the snow to Nikai. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice no longer that of a child. Nikai looked at Eliza, his dark eyes asking a question. She met his gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. They weren't prey hiding in a hole. Not anymore. "Tonight," Eliza said, her voice shaking but firm, "we don't hide, we fight." The sun began to dip below the frozen peaks, painting the snow in shades of blood and violet. The cold deepened. They didn't have much time. They were two wounded people and a boy against a man who had just murdered his own deputy in cold blood. The odds were impossible, but inside that cave, something had shifted. Fear had been burned away by fury, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. Sheriff Crowe was coming for a reckoning. He had no idea they were preparing to give him one. The body of Deputy Miller lay in the snow, a stark and brutal message. Crowe wouldn't be coming alone. He'd bring his men, including Jesse's father, and he would use Miller's death as proof of their savagery. He would twist the truth until it became a weapon. Inside the cave, the mood was grim. The small fire seemed to offer little comfort against the chilling certainty of the coming night. "He wants the land," Eliza stated, her voice flat. "That's what this has always been about. The slap in the barn was just an excuse." Nikai nodded, his hands busy weaving a tripwire from thin, tough vines he'd found at the back of the cave. "There is a story," he said, his voice a low murmur as he worked, "of a silver vein that runs through that ridge, hidden deep in the rock. The pact my ancestors made with the first settlers was to share the land, but to leave the silver in the earth. To them, it was a poison that drove men mad." "Crowe must have found an old map, or heard the story," Eliza reasoned, her mind racing. "He needed my family gone. He drove your people out. He's been trying to get that land for himself ever since." The scope of his greed was breathtaking. He hadn't just terrorized a town. He had orchestrated a campaign of theft and murder that spanned years. "He will not get it," Nikai said, his jaw tight. It wasn't a boast. It was a promise. They worked with a desperate, focused energy. Jesse, his face streaked with tears and dirt, proved to be small and quick. He squeezed through a narrow fissure at the back of the cave that Nikai had pointed out, a bolt hole that led to a higher ledge. He gathered piles of loose rocks, creating a small avalanche waiting for a trigger. Eliza, her leg a constant throbbing agony, sharpened stakes with Nikai's knife, her hands raw but steady. Nikai, meanwhile, rigged the entrance. He set the tripwire, connected to a heavy log poised to swing down. It wouldn't kill, but it would disarm and disorient the first man through. They weren't trying to massacre Crowe's men. They were trying to survive, to expose a tyrant. As darkness fell, a new sound reached them. Hoofbeats, many of them. They were coming. Down in Silver Creek, something was stirring. The gunshot that had killed Deputy Miller had echoed through the valley. A few brave souls had ridden out to investigate and found his body. but they also found 2 sets of tracks leading from the ridge above, Crowe's and Miller's. The story the sheriff spun when he rode back into town, that the Comanche savage had shot the boy, didn't quite add up. Mrs. Harper, the baker's widow, remembered the arrow Crowe had produced in the barn. She'd seen arrows like it before, sold as trinkets at the trading post. They weren't real. They were souvenirs. Tom the blacksmith remembered shoeing Crowe's horse that morning. He remembered the sheriff talking about needing to clear out some squatters on the old Mayfield place. He hadn't mentioned Comanches then. Doubt, once planted, is a stubborn root. People started talking. Quietly at first, in hushed tones over saloon tables and in darkened general stores. They remembered Eliza's kindness. They remembered Crowe's cruelty. And they looked at the fear that had ruled their lives, and for the first time, they began to question it. Caleb, Jesse's father, rode with the posse, his face a grim mask. Crowe had clapped him on the shoulder, telling him they were going to avenge Miller and get his boy back. But Caleb had seen the look in Crowe's eyes when he'd talked about the Mayfield land. It was a feverish, hungry look. He knew, deep in his gut, that his son wasn't a hostage. He was a witness, and Crowe didn't like witnesses. The ride to the cliffs was the longest of Caleb's life, his conscience at war with his fear. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as the posse approached the cliff face. "They're in that cave!" Crowe shouted, pointing. "The girl and the savage, they killed Miller. Go get 'em! Burn 'em out if you have to!" 2 of the younger, more reckless men urged their horses forward. "Let's go, Caleb!" one of them yelled. Caleb hesitated. His eyes scanned the dark mouth of the cave. "Pa!" a small voice cried out from the darkness above. "Don't do it, Pa!" Everyone looked up. Jesse was standing on a high ledge, his small frame silhouetted against the night sky. "The sheriff is lying. He shot Deputy Miller. I saw him." Crowe's face contorted with rage. "The boy is scared. His mind is twisted by that savage. Don't listen to him." He raised his own rifle and fired a shot toward Jesse, the bullet sparking off the rock just inches from the boy's head. That was the moment everything changed for Caleb. Seeing his own son nearly killed by the man he served, the flimsy cage of fear he'd lived in for years shattered. "No!" he roared, wheeling his horse around to face Crowe. "You leave him be!" "Get out of my way, Caleb, or you'll join the boy," Crowe snarled, turning his gun on him. But before he could fire, the first 2 deputies reached the mouth of the cave. The first man ducked inside and immediately yelled as his foot caught the tripwire. The heavy log swung down from the darkness, slamming into his chest and sending him flying back out into the snow, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The second man, stunned, was met with a volley of small, sharp rocks thrown by Eliza from just inside the entrance, forcing him to stumble back. From above, Jesse shoved the pile of rocks he had gathered. It wasn't a massive landslide, but it was enough. A cascade of stone and snow tumbled down the cliff face, not on the men, but in front of their horses. The animals panicked, rearing and screaming, throwing their riders into chaos. In the confusion, Nikai emerged from the cave. He wasn't armed with a rifle, but with a simple rope. He moved with a startling speed, looping it around the legs of a panicked deputy, who was trying to control his horse, pulling him to the ground. It was a rout. Not a battle, but a complete and total dismantling of Crowe's authority. His men were disoriented, disarmed, and now, hearing Jesse's cries and seeing Caleb's defiance, they were deeply uncertain. Crowe stared, his face a mask of disbelief. His perfect plan, his years of control, were unraveling in a matter of seconds. He was alone. His posse was in chaos, and Caleb now stood between him and the cave, his rifle leveled and steady. "It's over, Arlland," Caleb said, his voice raw. From the town, more lights were appearing. A crowd of townsfolk, led by Tom the blacksmith and carrying lanterns and old hunting rifles, were making their way up the path. They had heard the shots, and they had chosen, finally, to stop being afraid. Crowe looked from the defiant father to the rebellious town, to the dark cave that had swallowed his power. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He let out an inarticulate roar of fury, spun his horse around, and dug his spurs into its flanks. He galloped away into the darkness, not as a lawman, but as a fugitive. A heavy silence fell over the cliffside, broken only by the panting of the men and the whimpering of the horses. Eliza stepped out of the cave, leaning heavily on a carved stick, her face pale but resolute. Jesse scrambled down from his ledge and ran straight into his father's arms. Caleb held him tight, burying his face in the boy's hair, his shoulders shaking with relief. Nikai stood beside Eliza, his knife sheathed, watching as the people of Silver Creek approached. They stopped a few feet away, their faces a mixture of awe, guilt, and uncertainty. Tom the blacksmith looked at Eliza's splinted leg, at Nikai's blood-stained tunic, at the small, determined boy clinging to his father. He took off his hat. We were wrong, Miss Mayfield," he said, his voice thick. "We were cowards." Eliza looked at their faces, lit by the bobbing lanterns. She saw their shame, and she saw their hope. The cold of the winter night still bit at her skin, but for the first time in a long, long time, she felt a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with a fire. The reckoning had come, but it wasn't the one Crowe had planned. The departure of Sheriff Crowe didn't magically heal Silver Creek. It left a wound, a void filled with guilt and uncertainty. The townsfolk who had stood by and watched Eliza get dragged away now had to look her in the eye. In the days that followed the standoff at the cliff, a heavy quiet settled over the town. Eliza, Nikai, and Jesse did not return to Silver Creek. Not at first. They remained in the cave, which had transformed from a desperate refuge into a temporary home. Caleb brought them supplies, food, blankets, proper bandages. He and Jesse talked for hours, mending a bond that had been stretched to its breaking point. Caleb confessed the reason for his loyalty to Crowe. Years ago, he'd been involved in a card game that went bad, and a man had died. Crowe was the only other witness, and he had held the threat of the gallows over Caleb's head ever since. With Crowe gone, the threat was lifted, but the guilt remained. Eliza began to heal, in body and in spirit. Her leg slowly mended, the sharp pain dulling to a persistent ache. She walked with a limp, a permanent reminder of her fall, but she saw it not as a weakness, but as a mark of survival. She and Nikai fell into a comfortable rhythm. They rarely spoke of the past, but they built a new present, moment by moment. He taught her which plants could be used for medicine and which were good for dye. She taught him the words to the lullabies her mother used to sing. It was a language built not of words, but of shared actions, of mutual respect. Spring arrived, slowly at first, then in a rush. The snow melted, swelling the creek and turning the valley a vibrant, impossible green. The world felt new, washed clean. It was time to leave the cave. They didn't go far. At the base of the very cliff that had been meant to be her grave, they chose a spot for a new home. It was a place of power, a place of memory. With help from Caleb and a penitent Tom the blacksmith, they built a small, sturdy cabin. The stone for the foundation came from the cliffside. The timber came from fallen pines in the woods. As Eliza drove the first nail into a beam, the sharp, clean sound echoed in the clear mountain air. It was the sound of a new beginning. One day they walked into town together. Eliza, Nikai, Jesse, and Caleb. They walked side by side. The townsfolk stopped what they were doing and watched. There were no whispers this time, only a quiet, respectful silence. They walked to the town hall, where a new provisional mayor, a flustered but decent man who ran the general store, was trying to make sense of the town's legal records. Eliza asked for the deed to her family's land. The mayor found it, the paper old and brittle. In the ownership line, it still listed her father's name. She took a pen and in a clear, steady hand she crossed it out. She didn't write her own name. Instead she wrote, "The Silver Creek Compact." She pushed the paper toward Nikai. He added a symbol below her words, the mark of his family. Then Caleb signed his name, and Jesse, in his childish scrawl, added his. The land wouldn't belong to one person. It would belong to their found family, a pact between cultures, a promise kept. Life settled into a new kind of normal. The cabin by the cliff became a fixture of the landscape. Eliza's garden flourished. Nikai occasionally acted as a guide for travelers, his knowledge of the mountains unparalleled. Caleb became the town's new blacksmith, his work honest and strong, and Jesse grew tall and confident, a bridge between the town and the wild hills. The story of the girl thrown from the cliff, the Comanche warrior who saved her, and the tyrant sheriff they overthrew became a local legend, a cautionary tale about fear and a testament to courage. Years passed. The winter of 1876 was a distant memory. One summer afternoon, a traveler stopped by the cabin to water his horse. He saw a young man, Jesse, sitting by the stream, carefully carving a piece of wood. He saw a man with dark braided hair, Nikai, tending to a horse in a small corral. And he saw a woman with auburn hair and a slight limp, Eliza, hanging laundry on a line, her face peaceful. "I've heard stories about this place," the traveler said to Jesse. "They say a boy once turned against his own father right on this cliff." Jesse looked up from his carving and smiled. It was a genuine, easy smile. He glanced toward the cabin where Caleb was mending a fence alongside Nikai. "I didn't turn against my father," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I helped him choose a better side. We all did." Eliza heard him, and her own smile widened. She looked up at the jagged face of the cliff, its stone warm in the afternoon sun. It wasn't a place of death. It was the foundation of her home. It was the rock upon which she had built her life. The wind that swept down from the ridge was no longer a howl of despair, but a whisper of resilience, a promise that even after the harshest winter, spring will always come. The story of Eliza Mayfield is a powerful reminder that one person's defiance can ignite a revolution of the soul. It shows that family is not always the blood you are born with, but the people who stand with you when the world turns its back. Her journey from betrayal to building a new life on the edge of a cliff challenges us all to question the tyrants in our own lives and to find strength in the most unexpected alliances. What part of Eliza's story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're listening from. Your story becomes part of this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the harsh beauty of the Old West. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of unbreakable spirits. Until next time, stay brave and listen to the whispers on the wind.